The poor child had been tasked beyond her strength during the past 4 days. Through all she had been her mother's willing little handmaiden, soothing, helping, cheering the half-widowed woman by day, and watching and praying beside her all the night long. She knew that something terrible and mysterious was taking place at this moment, something that had been too terrible and mysterious for even kind, good Hans to tell. Then new thoughts came. Why had not Hans told her? It was a shame. It was her father as well as his. She was no baby. She had once taken a sharp knife from her father's hand. She had even drawn him away from the mother on that awful night when Hans, big as he was, could not help her. Why then must she be treated like one who could do nothing? Oh, how very still it was. How bitter, bitter cold. If Annie Bowman had only stayed home instead of going to Amsterdam, it wouldn't be so lonely. How cold her feet were growing. Was it the moaning that made her feel as if she were floating in the air? This would not do. The mother might need her help at any moment. Rousing herself with an effort, Gretel sat upright, rubbing her eyes and wondering that the sky was so bright and beautiful, wondering at the stillness in the cottage, more than all, at the laughter rising and falling in the distance. Soon she sank down again, the strange medley of thought growing more and more confused in her bewildered brain. What a strange lip the meester had! How the stork's nest upon the roof seemed to rustle and whisper down to her! How bright those knives were in the leathern case, brighter perhaps than the silver skates! If she had but worn her new jacket, she would not shiver so. The new jacket was pretty, the only pretty thing she had ever worn. God had taken care of her father so long, he would do it still. If those two men would but go away. Ah, now the meesters were on the roof. They were clambering to the top. No, it was her mother and Hans, or the storks. It was so dark, who could tell? The mound rocking, swinging in that strange way. How sweetly the birds were singing. They must be winter birds, for the air was thick with icicles. Not one bird, but 20. Oh, hear them, mother? Wake me, mother, for the race. I'm so tired with crying. A firm hand was laid upon her shoulder. Get up, little girl, cried a kind voice. This will not do, for you to lie here and freeze. Gretel slowly raised her head. She was so sleepy that it seemed nothing strange to her that Hilda van Glik should be leaning over her, looking with kind, beautiful eyes into her face. She had often dreamed it before. But she had never dreamed that Hilda was shaking her, roughly, almost dragging her by main force. Never dreamed she that before. Gretel! Gretel Brinker! You must wake! This was real. Gretel looked up. Still the lovely, delicate young lady was shaking, rubbing, fairly pounding her. It must be a dream. No, there was the cottage, and the stork's nest, and the meester's coach by the canal. She could see them now quite plainly. Her eyes were tingling, her feet throbbing, her hands were tingling. Hilda was forcing her to walk. At last, Gretel began to feel like herself again. I had been asleep, she faltered, rubbing her eyes with both hands and looking very much ashamed. Yes, indeed, entirely too much asleep, laughed Hilda, whose lips were very pale. But you're well enough now. Lean upon me, Gretel. There. Keep moving. You will soon be warm enough to go by the fire. Now, let me take you into the cottage. Oh, no, 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 Jufvrouw, not there. The meester is there. He sent me away. Hilda was puzzled, but she wisely forbore to ask at present for an explanation. Very well, Gretel. Try to walk faster. I saw you upon the mound some time ago, but I thought you were playing. That is right. Keep moving. All this time the kind-hearted girl had been forcing Gretel to walk up and down, supporting her with one arm, and with the other striving as well as she could to take off her own warm cape. Suddenly Gretel suspected her intention. "Oh, you Frau," she cried imploringly. "Please, never think of such a thing as that. Oh, please, keep it on. I'm burning all over, you Frau. I really am burning, not burning exactly, but pins and needles prickle me all over. Oh, you Frau, don't." The poor child's dismay was so genuine that Hilda hastened to reassure her. "Very well, Gretel. Move your arms, then, so. Why, your cheeks are as pink as roses already. I think the meester would let you in now. He certainly would. Is your father so very ill?" "Ah, Jungfrau," cried Gretel, weeping afresh. "He is dying, I think. There are 2 meesters in there with him at this moment, and the mother has scarce spoken today. Can you hear him groan, Jungfrau?" she added with a sudden terror. "The air buzzes so I cannot hear. He may be dead. Oh, I do wish I could hear him." Hilda listened. The cottage was very near, but not a sound could be heard. Something told her that Gretel was right. She ran to the window. "You cannot see there, my lady," sobbed Gretel eagerly. "The mother has oiled paper hanging inside, but at the other one, in the south end of the cottage, you can look in there. The paper is torn." Hilda, in her anxiety, ran round past the corner where the low roof was fringed with a loosened thatch. A sudden thought checked her. "It is not right for me to peep into another's house in this way," she said to herself. Then, softly calling to Gretel, she added in a whisper, "You may look. Perhaps he's only sleeping." Gretel tried to walk briskly toward the spot, but her limbs were trembling, and Hilda hastened to her support. "You are sick yourself, I fear," she said kindly. "No, not sick, Jungfrau. But my heart cries all the time now, even when my eyes are as dry as yours. Why, Jungfrau, your eyes are not dry. Are you crying for us?" "Oh, Jungfrau, if God sees you. Oh, I know my father will get better now." And the little creature, even while reaching to look through the tiny window, kissed Hilda's hand again and again. The sash was sadly patched and broken. A torn piece of paper hung halfway across it, and Gretel's face was pressed to the window. "Can you see anything?" whispered Hilda at last. "Yes, the father lies very still. His head is bandaged, and all their eyes are fastened upon him." "Oh, Jungfrau!" almost screamed Gretel as she started back and by a quick movement shook off her heavy wooden shoes. "I must go in to my mother. Will you come with me?" "Not now. The bell is ringing. I shall come again soon. Goodbye." And Gretel scarcely heard the words. She remembered for many a day afterward the bright, pitying smile on Hilda's face as she turned away. An angel could not have entered the cottage more noiselessly. Gretel, not daring to look at anyone, slid softly to her mother's side. The room was very still. She could hear the old doctor breathe. She could almost hear the sparks as they fell into the ashes on the hearth. Her mother's hand was very cold, but a burning spot glowed on her cheek, and her eyes were like a deer's, so bright, so sad, so eager. At last, there was a movement upon the bed, very slight, but enough to cause them all to start. Dr. Boykman leaned eagerly forward. Another movement. The large hand, so white and soft for a poor man's hand, twitched, then raised itself steadily toward the forehead. It felt the bandage, not in a restless, crazy way, but with a questioning movement that caused even Dr. Boykman to hold his breath. Then the eyes opened slowly. "Steady, steady," said the voice that sounded very strange to Gretel. "Shift that mat higher, boys. Now throw on the clay. The waters are rising fast. No time to—" Dame Brinker sprang forward like a young panther. She seized his hands and, leaning over him, cried, "Raff! Raff, boy! Speak to me! Is it you?" "Metji," he asked faintly. "I have been asleep. Hurt, I think. Where is little Hans?" "Here I am, father," shouted Hans, half mad with joy. But the doctor held him back. "He knows us!" screamed Dame Brinker. "Great God, he knows us! Gretel, Gretel, come see your father!" In vain Dr. Boykman commanded, "Silence!" and tried to force them from the bedside. He could not keep them off. Hans and his mother laughed and cried together as they hung over the newly awakened man. Gretel made no sound, but gazed at them all with glad, startled eyes. Her father was speaking in a faint voice. "Is the baby asleep, Metji?" "The baby!" echoed Dame Brinker. "Oh, Gretel, that is you! He calls Hans little Hans, 10 years asleep. Oh, mein Herr, you have saved us all. He has known nothing for 10 years. Children, why don't you thank the meester?" The good woman was beside herself with joy. Dr. Boykman said nothing, but his eye met hers. He pointed upward. She understood, and so did Hans and Gretel. With one accord, they knelt by the cot, side by side. Dame Brinker felt for her husband's hand, even while she was praying. Dr. Boykman's head was bowed. The assistant stood by the hearth with his back toward them. "Why do you pray?" murmured the father, looking feebly from the bed as they arose. "Is it God's day?" It was not Sunday, but his Frau bowed her head. She could not speak. "Then we should have a chapter," said Raff Brinker, speaking slowly. "I do not know how it is. I am very, very weak. Mayhap the minister will read to us." Gretel lifted the big Dutch Bible from its carved shelf. Dr. Boykman, rather dismayed at being called a minister, coughed and handed the volume to his assistant. "Read," he muttered. "These people must be kept quiet, or the man will die yet." When the chapter was finished, Dame Brinker motioned mysteriously to the rest by way of telling them that her husband was asleep. "Now you, Frau," said the doctor in subdued tones, as he drew on his thick woolen mittens, "there must be perfect quiet. You understand? This is truly a most remarkable case. I shall come again tomorrow. Give the patient no food today." And bowing hastily, he left the cottage, followed by his assistant. His grand coach was not far away. The driver had kept the horses moving slowly up and down by the canal nearly all the time the doctor had been in the cottage. Hans went out also. "May God bless you, mein Herr," he said, blushing and trembling. "I can never repay you, but if—" "Yes, you can," interrupted the doctor crossly. "You can use your wits when the patient wakes up. This clacking and sniveling is enough to kill a well man. let alone one lying on the edge of his grave. If you want your father to get well, keep him quiet." So saying, Dr. Boykman, without another word, stalked off to meet his coach, leaving Hans standing there with eyes and mouth wide open. Hilda was reprimanded severely that day for returning late to school after recess and for imperfect recitations. She had remained near the cottage until she heard Dame Brinker laugh, until she had heard Hans say, "Here I am, father," and then she had gone back to her lessons. What wonder that she had missed them? How could she get a long string of Latin verbs by heart when her heart did not care a fig for them, but would keep saying to itself, "Oh, I am so glad! I am so glad!" Bones are strange things. One would suppose that they knew nothing at all about school affairs. But they do. Even Jacob Poots's bones, buried as they were in flesh, were sharp in the matter of study hours. Early on the morning of his return, they ached through and through, giving Jacob a twinge at every stroke of the school bell, as if to say, "Stop that clapper. There's trouble in it." After school, on the contrary, they were quiet and comfortable. In fact, seemed to be taking a nap among their cushions. The other boys' bones behaved in a similar manner. But that is not so remarkable. Being nearer the daylight than Jacob's, they might be expected to be more learned in the ways of the world. Master Ludwig's especially were like beauty, only skin deep. They were the most knowing bones you ever heard of. Just before him, ever so quietly, a grammar book with a long lesson marked in it, and immediately the sly bone over his eyes would set up such an aching. Request him to go to the garret for you or for a foot stove. Instantly the bones would remind him that he was too tired. Ask him to go to the confectioner's a mile away, and presto, not a bone would remember that it ever had been used before. Bearing all this in mind, you will not wonder when I tell you that our 5 boys were among the happiest of the happy throng pouring forth from the schoolhouse that day. Peter was in excellent spirits. He had heard through Hilda of Dame Brinker's laugh and of Hans's joyous words. He needed no further proof that Ralph Brinker was a cured man. In fact, the news had gone forth in every direction for miles around. Persons who had never before cared for the Brinkers, or even mentioned them, except with a contemptuous sneer or a shrug of pretended pity, now became singularly familiar with every point of their history. There was no end to the number of ridiculous stories that were flying about. Hilda, in the excitement of the moment, had stopped to exchange a word with the doctor's coachman as he stood by the horses, pummeling his chest and clapping his hands. Her kind heart was overflowing. She could not help pausing to tell the cold, tired-looking man that she thought the doctor would be out soon. She even hinted to him that she suspected, only suspected, that a wonderful cure had been performed, an idiot brought to his senses. Nay, she was sure of it, for she had heard his widow laugh. No, not his widow, of course, but his wife, for the man was as much alive as anybody, and for all she knew, sitting up and talking like a lawyer. All this was very indiscreet. Hilda, in an impenitent sort of way, felt it to be so. But it is always so delightful to impart pleasant or surprising news. She went tripping along by the canal, quite resolved to repeat the sin as often as she could and tell nearly every girl and boy in the school. Meantime, Jan Zoon Kolp came skating by. Of course, in 2 seconds, he was striking slippery attitudes and shouting saucy things to the coachman, who stared at him in indolent disdain. This, to Jan Zoon, was equivalent to an invitation to draw nearer. The coachman was now upon his box, gathering up his reins and grumbling at his horses. Janzoon accosted him. "I say, what's going on in the idiot's cottage? Is your boss in there?" Coachman nodded mysteriously. "Phew," whistled Janzoon, drawing closer. "Old Brinker dead?" The driver grew big with importance and silent in proportion. "See here, old pincushion. I'd run home yonder and get you a chunk of gingerbread if I thought you would open your mouth." Old pincushion was human. Long hours of waiting had made him ravenously hungry. At Janzoon's hint, his countenance showed signs of a collapse. "That's right, old fellow. Hurry up. What the news? Old Brinker dead?" "No. Cured. Got his wits," said the coachman, shooting forth his words one at a time like so many bullets. Like bullets, figuratively speaking, that hit Janzoon Kolb. He jumped as if he'd been shot. "Goody Gunts! You don't say so!" The man pressed his lips together and looked significantly toward Master Kolb's shabby residence. Just then, Janzoon saw a group of boys in the distance. Hailing them in a rowdy style common to boys of his stamp all over the world, whether in Africa, Japan, Amsterdam, or Paris, he scampered toward them, forgetting coachman, gingerbread, everything but the wonderful news. Therefore, by sundown, it was well known throughout the neighboring country that Dr. Boykman, chancing to stop at the cottage, had given the idiot Brinker a tremendous dose of medicine as brown as gingerbread. It had taken 6 men to hold him while it was poured down. The idiot had immediately sprung to his feet in full possession of all his faculties, knocked over the doctor, or thrashed him. There was admitted to be a slight uncertainty as to which of these penalties was inflicted, then sat down and addressed him for all the world like a lawyer. After that, he had turned and spoken beautifully to his wife and children. Dame Brinker had laughed herself into violent hysterics. Hans had said, "Here I am, father, your own dear son," and Gretel had said, "Here I am, father, your own dear Gretel," and the doctor had afterward been seen leaning back in his carriage, looking as white as a corpse. All, of course, the gossip that floated along. When Dr. Boykman called the next day at the Brinker cottage, he could not help noticing the cheerful, comfortable aspect of the place. An atmosphere of happiness breathed upon him as he opened the door. Dame Brinker sat complacently knitting beside the bed. Her husband was enjoying a wonderful sleep, and Gretel was noiselessly kneading rye bread on the table in the corner. The doctor did not remain long. He asked a few simple questions, appeared satisfied with the answers, and after feeling his patient's pulse, said, "Ah, very weak yet, Jufrau, very weak indeed. He must have nourishment. You may begin to feed the patient, not too much. And what you do give him, let it be strong and of the best." "Black bread we have, mynheer, and porridge," replied Dame Brinker. "They have always agreed with him well." "Tut, tut," said the doctor, frowning. "Nothing of the kind. He must have the juice of fresh meat, white bread, dried and toasted, good Malaga wine, and the man looks cold. Give him more covering, something light and warm. Where is the boy?"